Over the past week, I spent about 40 hours playing Clair Obscure Expedition 33, a mouthful of a game made by first-timer studio Sandfall Interactive, comprised of what has been widely reported as 30 Frenchies in a mansion, alongside a whole host of third parties filling the gaps in between. This will be a spoiler-free referendum showcasing mostly footage from Act 1. However, if I am to summarize my feelings, Expedition 33 is about as close to a masterpiece as you can get, at least in my eyes. It is the single best game I've played since Elden Ring and now comfortably sits in my top 5. What you get out of $50 or a Game Pass subscription is in equal parts beautiful and inspired, a narrative tour de force that manages to leverage the medium to tell a poignant story of grief, attachment, and impermanence. It is also backed by one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard, quite frankly, not just in a game, but in all audiovisual media. Not since 2018's reimagining of Suspiria has a score stuck with me in this way. But beyond all that, what Expedition 33 has done is achieve this level of praise in the package of a turn-based RPG, a subgenre that I honestly never enjoyed. I can't think of the last time I actually beat a turn-based game, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to suggest that this format is one of my least favorite. To briefly explain why, I will try not to intellectualize my disposition too much. In a basic sense, I dislike when control over my actions is taken away. This is part of the reason why so many traditional RPGs become dry after a certain amount of time. Even exceptional stories such as Red Dead Redemption 2 are suffocated by monotonous trailing missions that see me listening more than playing. I had the same experience with Ghosts of Tsushima, another critically acclaimed RPG of the last 2 years, wherein I bounced off it incredibly quickly because I found the process of dialogue to be extremely boring. Click character, watch their gums flap for a minute or two, then follow them as they continue yapping. The fact that so much of the gameplay, especially early on, has been separated away from the storytelling is frustrating to me. This is because one of the coolest things this medium, video games, can do is ingratiate you to the characters on screen through interaction. It's an interactive medium, so wrestling my control away tends to disconnect me from the character. Not just the protagonist, but everyone, since now they have become uninteractive objects on screen. While that is perfectly reasonable for a television series or movie, it lacks the same weight in a game because games suffer from the inherent issue of user-dictated pacing. That is why cutscenes work as they do. You need to have the best possible pacing for a certain moment, because if the user is to run into a tree for 2 hours, they lose the impact of whatever beat the writers want to hit. Pacing is so much more crucial than some people may think. If all of a game's story becomes a binary of gameplay and cutscene where most of the actual narrativization unfolds out of your hands, then all it feels like to me is watching a 2-hour movie over the course of 30-odd hours of bathroom breaks. It's not that I can't become attached to a story, it's that I straight up forget it. Even great ones like The Witcher 3 are broken up by dozens of hours of unrelated gameplay sections, and by the time I return back, I need to remind myself that Yennefer does in fact smell like lilac and gooseberries. Marrying cutscene, a lack of control, with gameplay, a return of control, is actually what made God of War's 2018 continuation so effective. It utilized the cinematic technique of the quote-unquote long take, a single continuous shot, to ground you in a place and time, as well as imbue your actions with urgency, and finally, not separate your personal gameplay with that of the character's actions in a cutscene. While I was thoroughly underwhelmed by the sequel, Ragnarok, I still adore the first game because of this. A lot of the larger RPGs, such as the standard Ubisoft fare, play into these tropes. The story is, regardless of how choices affect the conclusion, totally out of your hands. Often literally, as in your controller is on the coffee table or desk, begging to be picked up again. Now, there are RPGs that blend these things better. I mentioned 2018's God of War game, but I would be remiss not to shout out Naughty Dog's effort as well. Their work on the Uncharted series as a pioneer of cinematic storytelling through the Indiana Jones-esque romps of Nathan Drake is what gave way to Last of Us, arguably the most influential cinematic title to have ever been made in this medium. So influential, in fact, that even the format of older person and younger person go on adventure has become standard. That's not to say it hasn't been done before, though. I love both Last of Us games, the second being controversial but also substantially more rewarding, thought out, and experimental. While the first game felt like an apt transposition of a great television series, at least at the time, the second game felt more akin to, well, a game. The actual gameplay was tighter and more engaging, and the moment-to-moment interactions blended seamlessly with the cutscenes and direct storytelling. It also utilized the medium, something a lot of large cinematic games just don't. When I say utilize the medium, I am referring to a studio's understanding of gameplay and how to connect it with storytelling. One of the most overused examples of this is, of course, From Software's work on Dark Souls, wherein the majority of the storytelling happens through player agency, not just in how your choices impact the ending, but by how much story you siphon based on what you, as the player, do. How you navigate the UI, how often you read item descriptions or exhaust dialogue with NPCs, whether you follow their obtuse trails and complete their bizarre questlines, or even if you choose to kill them and loot their body. All of this plays a role in a grander narrative, that of your adventure through the desolate, dangerous landscapes of Lordran, Drangleic, and so on. The narrative of these games isn't just the background details rendered comprehensible by VaatiVidya, but your experience as a whole. To this day, this series and its From Software offspring are some of the purest forms of video game storytelling because of how minimally they remove the connection to your character. Interactivity is the forefront of story. It always interested me how gameplay-forward games manage to tell compelling stories because they can't be as reliant on established norms and tropes of cinematic storytelling. They can't fade you out into a well-composed frame to relay a theme, or railroad you into a set list of dialogues that connect you to a character. Yet the storylines and their inhabitants in, say, Elden Ring have stuck with me far more than those in Ghosts of Tsushima. Not because the characters are written better, although they often are, in my opinion, but because my agency formed the backbone of connection. I wanted to see and understand more, which led me to pay closer attention and delve deeper into the overarching lore. By hiding the story behind the gameplay rather than separating them altogether, I found myself far more invested when I made my final choice in Elden Ring. To return back to Clair Obscure Expedition 33, you may be surprised to hear that the storytelling is more traditional. After all, it's heavily inspired by the JRPGs of yore, going so far as to call itself a JRPG in all but the location it was made, which is reasonable. I don't think a JRPG is defined by it being a byproduct of Japan. It's a genre, and much like any genre, it can be made anywhere. Like Star Wars is a Western even though it doesn't take place in the American frontier. This conversation is a little muddy because it's interpretable in the same way the endless arguments over whether or not Avatar: The Last Airbender is an anime or not. Anime is of course more so a medium, although its inclusion of certain genre tropes distinguish it by more than just the language being spoken. The kind of writing, the presentation, the animation styles, alongside techniques, it all culminates into what is identifiable as anime. One of my favorite examples of this is actually the anime grunting that is often the target of jokes.
Then cut to the chase.
The grunts and groans given by characters to acknowledge something. This is actually a byproduct of limited scope and budget. A lot of anime, especially television anime, is produced on a shoestring budget, so many scenes in an individual episode are comprised of panning still frames. Maybe a character's mouth opens and shuts between two frames, or a character covers her mouth to save time. These funny groans are a way for the voice actor, as the character, to acknowledge what is being said without the need for an animated reaction. So many of the most innovative elements of anime are cost-saving techniques to produce episodes cheaper and quicker. That's part of the reason why what is often cited as the best moment of an individual episode is often the 1 or 2 minutes of proper animation happening on screen. JRPGs can be seen in a similar way because these two things are cut from the same cloth. Both have pulpy, often saccharine writing, overly expressive characters to account for lower budget animation, standard thematics from modern Japanese media, and a whole host of readily identifiable tropes that paved the way to creating the anime lexicon so many fans use today. Expedition 33 carries forth many of these standards, just a bunch of hot people on a world-ending adventure full of melodrama, drama, and ever-rising stakes. With that said, it's not immediately recognizable as a JRPG, mainly due to the aesthetic. The game is rendered using Unreal Engine 5, giving a polished sleekness and realism even in such a fantastical setting. The engine is advanced enough to allow for smaller teams to create games that are visually indistinguishable from AAA outputs. This is in part because of how Unreal solves for a lot of game development pitfalls that other engines may be privy to. The game was developed over the course of 5 years, and even though Unreal certainly helped with the burden of creating such a large game, it is still eye-opening what a solid development pipeline can achieve even when the amount of hands toiling away at the project are 10 times less than most games of comparable size and presentation. It's a smaller game than the average JRPG, but that may be because one of the more common tropes of JRPGs is the grinding required while pursuing the campaign. There's less here, although if I were to guess, the amount of diversity present in Sandfall's game is as much if not more than your average standard JRPG. There are so many different biomes to explore in this childlike rendition of Phantasmagoria, a dreamlike world that came about as a result of the Fracture, an event that uprooted what seems to be Belle Epoque France, obliterating a continent and sending pieces of it into the ocean. At the center of it all is the monolith, guarded by a giant woman, the Paintress, who every year paints a number into its edifice that signifies the incoming gommage, or erasure. The gommage is really the crux of the game world, as everyone who is that number's age or greater disintegrates into ash and rose petals. The Paintress is the arbiter of death, and every day the citizens of Lumiere wake up only to be reminded of their ever-encroaching demise. It's a very literal depiction of our impermanence as people, as souls, and our ever-churning grief at the knowledge that our flitting lives are becoming shorter by the year. These numbers are painted in descending order, meaning that every year the number decreases by 1, and every year the citizens of Lumiere send their oldest members on an expedition to try and stop the Paintress and break the cycle. Every year these expeditions fail, and every year people gommage younger and younger. We begin this tale on the day of the gommage and the day before the next expedition, which our protagonist, Gustave, soon to become the oldest man in Lumiere, will be a member of. Alongside him, his surrogate sister or daughter, depending how you look at it, Maëlle, is eager to join the expeditioners on their journey into the unknown, the continent surrounding the monolith. Maëlle is 16, meaning that she has good years ahead of her, yet she chooses to go because being reminded of just how little time is left makes you more likely to act. The story hinges on our connection with Gustave as the prologue to the very first act unspools over a gut-wrenching hour. You greet Sophie, who is 33 and therefore will gommage once the sun sets. Your history with her is complicated, spurned lovers, a relationship that never quite succeeded, yet your feelings with one another are very clear. You spend the last evening with her and you watch the sunset together. The Paintress rises, paints, and sulks back down in the shadow of the monolith. It's a jaw-dropping sequence, not only because of the visuals and exceptional score that is more than likely to lasso a couple tears from you, but because the stakes were established and dissipated in an instant. The impetus to travel is out of hopelessness. There is no saving Sophie, there is no unwinding the lost. It is grief, anger, and fear that pushes Expedition 33 out into the open ocean. It is the almost propagandistic determination to blaze a trail for the future, knowing full well that you may never return, and what you uncover there will become another stepping stone for a future expedition's journey to stopping the Paintress. As Gustave says every time you charge up his most powerful attack, for those who come after. It is a remark on future generations as well as future expeditions. Sadly, whatever hope there is quickly fades, not as a calm ash petal gommage, but with a wicked slice. I will now stop talking about the story because if you haven't played Expedition 33, you should stop this video and go do so. It is well worth your time. The issue is that the game story and soundtrack are so exceptional, and I am preventing myself from discussing half of what makes the game so great. So instead, let's return back to broader strokes. Outside of my pre-established issues with turn-based games, I also never quite enjoyed a lot of their storytelling techniques, particularly in how the world is exposited and how character writing closely resembles some of the more well-worn and unappealing tropes found in television anime. The oddly incessant need to infantilize the woman characters, the overabundance of romance options, and the general tendency to overshadow what could be an emotionally poignant moment with childishness. It all composes the image of a game that I may just not be in the demographic for, and while I am sure they are great in their own way, I have yet to be able to feel captured by the storytelling in any particular one. That, matched with the issues I have with turn-based combat, create a video game that feels as though I play it less than I watch it, and what I'm watching is wholly uninteresting, at least to me. Clair Obscure manages to overcome some of these more direct pitfalls of gameplay by integrating real-time action elements into its turn-based function. While this isn't innovative on its own, what is its ability to elevate it. You can dodge, you can parry, you can jump, you can shoot, it's all good stuff, however, the presentation is what sells it. The audiovisual feedback of successfully doing an action is as important as choosing to do it at all. You can have great parry timings, but if they don't sound as satisfying as they do in Kazan the Last Berserker, then you've only half succeeded in design. Thankfully, the parry mechanics are well designed and well presented, and even give you the incentive to both dodge and parry depending on the situation. Dodges are more lenient so you can learn the encounter with them, but reward you with less AP, the currency you spend on your powerful abilities, while parries are much more difficult and more rewarding. Clair Obscure manages to build upon these systems. You will get midway through Act 2 while still unlocking new mechanics and even characters. Each character in your roster comes with a unique weapon type, ability tree to unlock, and most importantly, system to understand. For example, Gustav operates on charges that you build the more abilities you use, and then you can expend those charges with an incredibly powerful blast of lightning. Later characters are far more complex, and this opens the door for buildcraft. That is, after all, a dominant trait of beloved JRPGs, particularly turn-based ones. Because combat is more meticulously paced and your turns have time for deliberation, the developer can imbue the game with complex, overlapping systems that must be considered when making your next move. Clair Obscure does have real-time elements, but your choices are not timed, and that's where the pictos come in. These are passive traits you collect throughout your playtime. Each character can equip 3, and if you win 4 battles with any individual picto equipped, they are added into a grander library. In this library, you can activate their passive effects for a cost. Strangely, the best comparison that comes to mind is actually the Pick 10 system in Call of Duty Black Ops 2, if anyone remembers that. You have a set amount of points to spend, and equipping certain pictos costs a certain amount of those points. The amount of points increases as you play and allows you to build a really fleshed out and powerful character by the endgame. This is at once freeing and game-breaking because holy shit, by the third act I was essentially one-shotting every single enemy in the game. In the most non-spoiler way possible, one of my biggest criticisms of Expedition 33 is how open the game is in Act 3 and how unsure I was of whether or not to pursue the story or the side missions. I chose the latter, sadly trivializing the grandest boss fights in the game as a result of this newfound power. I almost wish they railroaded you through the narrative to not rob you of those moments. Regardless, the diversity of builds is really awesome, and thankfully, because of the way the real-time elements are incorporated, I always felt in control of my choices. Even the simple QTEs that you do when activating an ability never become boring to me because, in a minimal sense, I enjoyed playing a role in my character's action. Once you brave the prologue, you complete a short level and eventually are greeted with the overworld. This is very clearly inspired by older JRPGs, and it's such a cool feature. Honestly, I love it. You get to traverse this enormous landscape in scaled miniature, and as you unlock more movement options, more areas open up in a very Metroidvania kind of way. The exploration of the overworld is an inspired way to connect levels in a space, even when the space itself is so stylized. The overworld is populated by enemies, some are way harder than others, meant for the endgame. I love this mixture because it creates unique landmarks to remember, unique encounters to come back to. There's this enormous metallic concept wading through the ocean that if you run into, you must fight and it promptly one-shots you. To gauge my power with every act, I would return back to it and do a rematch until I finally was able to completely one-shot it. If I had to leverage any criticism at the overworld, it would be twofold. Sometimes your character can get stuck on small divots in the ground, creating some rather clunky movement in narrow sections, and the second is a bit bigger of an issue. I wish there was a way to mark locations on your map or know where you've been and where you haven't been. There are dozens of zones around you, some being endgame zones nestling into an otherwise first act area. I want to remember where that is so I can revisit it, and right now there really is no way to do that. I have to either take notes on my phone or have a great memory. As I played through the campaign, I constantly thought about what worked so well about it. While the story itself is very high concept and they really go wild with it, the real element that spoke to me was the maturity through which the characters were written. Unlike some games that it may have been inspired by, I never felt as though I was watching conversations between children wearing the guise of adults. What was equally fascinating was that I never once questioned its inspiration. While some of these tropes were left behind, the overarching understanding of what makes a JRPG narratively still remains. The pulpy, saccharine, almost cheesy moments are there, but they're there with such a heart-rending sincerity. Sincerity is crucial. One of the more common points I've seen brought up about this game's writing is how it avoids the cliches of modern, overly cynical blockbusters. People have gotten sick of this cynicism found in, say, Marvel movies, where every world-ending threat is undercut by smarmy remarks and a "that just happened" attitude. When leveraged poorly, cynicism can feel like shame, as though the writer is embarrassed about what is on screen, and I think that trickles down to the audience, as though they should not be invested in this because even the characters on screen don't take it too seriously. None of this happens in Expedition 33. The threats are the threats, and they aren't something to trivialize, but the game is far from overly serious. Something I rarely see mentioned is just how funny the game can be. The comedy here is sincere and something that you can laugh alongside the characters with. It makes you able to empathize better with their situation because suddenly you are sitting alongside them at the camp. I like that a lot of the humor comes from characters cracking jokes at each other rather than at the expense of the game. One of the most overt examples of this is the fairy tale-esque character of Esquier, an enormous being made of air and good vibes.
Bonjour, mes amis.
Hey, bonjour mon ami. CL? What? I don't know. He seems nice.
Esquier is so sickeningly sweet that his presence wraps around in on itself and becomes charming and lovable. His dialogues with the main characters and his general predisposition for positivity becomes a harsh juxtaposition to the hopelessness found in the story. That is why a lot of this positive sincerity works. It's often opposed to harsh realities that are never trivialized. Through this opposition, Esquier becomes an outlet for us, the player, as well. Whenever he's on screen, it's a reprieve from the darkness in the shadow of the monolith. And that shadow is extremely dark and heartbreaking. The comedy of Clair Obscure sits comfortably between earth-shattering revelations and some of the saddest moments that I have ever experienced in a game. That is due to how well rendered and acted these characters are, making their emotions even more believable. It's also because the premise gives enough headroom for these characters to be themselves. There's the minor criticism of sometimes the lip syncing being a little bit off, but for the major rendered cinematics, it is genuinely breathtaking. You often return back to base camp, where you can upgrade your equipment and speak to your entire team and spend time with them individually. These are small, dialogue-driven vignettes that ingratiate you to their history, their motivations, and their personality. These are crucial beats, and I cannot emphasize how well these characters are realized and how different they are in their allegiance to each other. Ciel, Lune, Maël, and Gustave have a bond over a mutual goal, a friendship over mutual grief, and individual beliefs from close-held secrets. The decisions made, good or bad, are filtered through our understanding of them. One of the earliest examples in the game is an argument between Gustave and Lune.
I am not letting Maël die out here. I'm taking her home.
What? No, we have a mission!
Oh, fuck the mission! Fuck the mission, Lune! What are we gonna do, huh? Tell me. What are we gonna do? We're gonna take down the paintress, just the three of us? My gun and your sparks?
I didn't take you for a coward.
I'm not a coward.
You swore the oath. When one falls, we continue.
Yes, I know.
When one falls. When one falls. Not if. When.
Lune is driven by order. She is committed to a standard and believes deviating from it will bring about more harm. Gustave, on the other hand, is driven by emotion, both from the grief of losing Sophie and an effort to protect Maël. Fuck the rules, we need to save who we can. You are more likely to agree with Gustav here because we are privy to aligning emotionally first, and we are by and large more emotionally connected with Gustav than Lune. As the game progresses and we understand the experiences that paint Lune's history, her arguments begin to hold a lot more weight and our empathy extends across the aisle. She becomes more motivational than constricting. I questioned what about all of this worked so well, again avoiding the very obvious quality of the writing and acting. I ended up considering the format itself. This is a turn-based game, and more often than not, turn-based games are led by a party. You have multiple characters you cycle through on any individual turn. I wondered, what does this gameplay operation bring in terms of narrative? The most immediate answer is companionship and teamwork. You are playing with these characters, and as a result, their bond and your bond grows. They feel more like a believable team because your interaction with them is both narrative and gameplay. That's not to say that you can't develop this outside of turn-based systems, as we've seen with The Last of Us and God of War, but this becomes exponentially more complicated the more characters you have. With 6 characters on screen, retaining connection through gameplay becomes somewhat laborious. How can you intertwine their motivations with their actions in a game, especially when that action is dictated by AI and not the player? Turn-based games may be a great way to develop party connections because you are pacing each character's story yourself. And while I'm not in love with turn-based games because I loved Expedition 33, I am more understanding to them conceptually. Guiltily, I must admit that I had a very simplistic outlook when I was younger. Turn-based games existed in lieu of being able to develop exceptional real-time combat. That is an incredibly dumb statement and dumb conclusion, and this narrative purpose is evidence of one of the reasons why. Extrapolating that out, there's also the strategy involved in buildcraft and decision-making that comes about from understanding how turns are dictated. There's a lot more there, but these things aren't nearly as interesting to me because they aren't why I enjoyed Clair Obscure. The strategy was fun enough, but would this game really hold my attention if all I had was the combat system and buildcraft? I'm cautious to say no, much like how Elden Ring wouldn't be my favorite game if not for its world and level design. I have spoken time and time again how a Souls-like is as much begotten to level design as it is its combat, and the latter without the former becomes an overly simple facsimile of something far greater. I don't particularly care for the combat system in a Souls-like. I care for the situations that a combat system like that can create, the exploration it can birth from its simplicity. The same would apply here. I enjoyed the combat enough because what it became in service of is the characters that I truly connected with. My choices for who to play were as much dependent on whose story I was following at any given time as they were whose kit I enjoyed the most. That speaks to the connections made with the characters and how well integrated the combat is with facilitating those connections in the first place. Additionally, some of these encounters, particularly the boss fights, utilize the real-time elements very well. Some of these bosses are absolutely epic, things you have to see to believe. When I say that Clair Obscure did something impossible, I of course mean it made me finish a turn-based game. That's clear, and to me, an achievement in and of itself. What has become more concerning is that I didn't just finish a turn-based game, I fell in love with a turn-based game. I am now holding it in the pantheon of best games I have ever played. It is more than likely to be my game of the year, and that's not despite the combat system. A game would never be my favorite if I had to overlook 80% of my playtime with it. It's shocking that a year where Kingdom Come 2, one of the greatest RPGs of the generation, came out, I ended up enjoying Clair Obscure even more. Perhaps this is even better evidence of these independent, more vision-focused studios starting to fully overshadow some AAA mainstays. Because much like Clair Obscure, Kingdom Come 2 was also a result of a beautifully rendered and collective vision. The impossible is transformative then. It changed my perspective and my outlook on certain genres. I cannot understate how enjoyable that is when it can often feel like your beliefs are final, immutable after a certain age. I want to eventually create a longer retrospective on this game, particularly its narrative, as I think it goes far deeper than the textual high-concept story that is defining it. Until then, I am pleased to see how well this game has done, how many copies it sold, and how positive the reception has been. If you are like me and feel some type of way about turn-based games, I would recommend setting those biases aside and just trying. After all, that is the best we can do.